We've seen some things come through in the past about plastic bags, and we can talk about straws as well in a second, but things like yogurt cups and bread bags and all these things that are plastic that you never really think like, oh, I'm using plastic. And, I get tripped up all the time too. Like, I'm really conscious about my plastic, and I've tried to advance that over the years. But sometimes I'll pick something up and, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is lined with plastic. It can really be tricky.
Crazy. It's so hard to avoid it. And what's even more amazing is the fact that it's not even like so much of even our personal use. There's so much in the back end that is used. I sell wholesale goods to big box stores, and many of these stores require us to individually polybag each item, only for them to arrive to the store, be pulled out of the box, ripped out of the bag, and then put on display. And it's like, what was even the point? There's just so much waste, and we don't even see it. That's what's crazy, but it's like all those little things like the yogurt cups and the things that your lettuce comes in, it's even like the bag is plastic, you'd even think plastic bag, and it's just like, it's crazy. It's everywhere, isn't it?
It is. And I mean, I'd be remiss to not point out that, with COVID, we've also been very kind of challenged and had to really think about how to approach that issue, because disposable items and PPE, there are plastic components in these things, and some of them have been very necessary. So we've tried to put out recommendations in terms of, the safety around using reusable items at this time, and spoken to medical professionals around that so that there is actually a scientific basis. Of course, we also support that people need to do what they need to do to be safe. And that's always been kind of like top of mind, of course, during this time. Mm-hmm. But what is also shown to us is that plastic unfortunately, it does have a place in lives, right? It's important for medical equipment. And there's some uses that plastic is a phenomenal material. And, we can't really argue against that in many instances. But it also goes to show why it's so important that we stop use in areas that we do not need to use plastic, so that the damage overall and the impact of plastic is severely, is really reduced. And it's left to these like really critical uses that are saving lives, as opposed to like us walking down the street and we can't be bothered, taking an extra few steps to go back to our house and gather our cup. We go and get a disposable one, is really thinking about the sort of sacrifices that we can make in our everyday life so that we can ensure that we make a bigger impact in the grand scheme of things.
Well, it's interesting. Like, I was just using my reusable coffee mug wherever I went, but now I can't if I do go for coffee, they won't serve it in my mug. Yeah. It's a hygiene thing then. And so it's interesting, like really frustrating sometimes when you try to make those efforts even. And maybe you can speak to also like our listeners, like it doesn't have to be like dramatically change your whole life overnight. It's small reductions here and there that make huge differences over the long run.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. And I mean, I certainly, from my personal experience, I didn't change everything at once. Because, this is like a lifestyle, right? It's not just like a crash diet. You don't just like give up plastic for a week and you've changed the world. It's really something that you have to like create a habit of. And it's really about, I think, making sure that you make conscious choices. Like, we can't always be perfect. And there are times where plastic will potentially creep into your life. And just now is probably an example of that, right? And, despite your best efforts, there might be an increase in your use of plastic. But I have to say that, if you make it something that is like a decision-making process for you, it's a factor you consider in your decisions, and it just becomes ingrained in you, it's eventually something that I feel like doesn't become as much of a burden to yourself, because it's just who you are and what you do and how you approach life.
So how can our community here, how can they make an impact besides just doing it personally? What are ways we can get involved with the community, or do things just on our own that help? I always think of the three from the beach. Yeah. I believe it was Jack Farley came onto the show and we talked about, grabbing just 3 bits of plastic when you leave the beach is just enough. One of the things that I wonder that maybe Surfrider could maybe be part of an initiative is, the garbage, the waste disposal on the beaches are really poor for holding plastic or any small bits of trash and rubbish, actually. And are there ways that we can make it more easy for us to throw it out and make sure that it's not going to fly away and get back onto the beach?
Yeah, no, really important questions. I love that you asked about the action, because I think that's a really important part. It's like, let's inform each other and learn from each other, but let's also be taking action on these items. And I think like the way that it kind of boils down is that we have our advocacy part, right? So there's actually action alerts that are set up, for example, for the extended producer responsibility, where you can fill out a really 2-second form that sends a letter on your behalf to your elected official. And that's super important, because elected officials need to hear from the people in their community before they will vote in certain ways. It's just the way it works. So the more people we can get taking these actions, the better. And you can see these on the Surfrider Instagram at Surfrider NYC, and also on our website. But to your point about thinking about, the sort of like everyday actions that we can take, especially thinking that, many of us in this community spend a lot of time at the beach, is really about, the advocacy really looks at the center of the issue. But when we're on the beach, how can we also provide some mitigation practices and support? And we have, Surfrider has hosted several beach cleanups over the years. And we work a lot with the community and the Parks Department to try and create systems and practices that will be more effective at controlling the garbage issue. So a couple of things that I think are kind of top of mind that I'll share tonight are, one, Surfrider could host beach cleanups every single day of the year. And I don't know if we'd even tackle the garbage problem, to be quite honest, right? It's just there's a lot of garbage out there. And that's why the tackling it at the core is so important. But one thing we've really noticed actually over the last year, when our ability to be able to host large groups has been reduced, is that there's something really impactful about empowering people to make this part of their daily lives. So we launched the Solo Beach Cleanup Initiative. And what that encourages people to do is to go out on their own. Say if you're going for a surf, like make sure you add on like an extra hour or something, and you go out for a beach cleanup. And now that some of the safety measures are being reduced a little bit, perhaps there's a small group of you and your friends that can go out and start cleaning the beach. And while this was a measure that was put in place in response to not being able to gather large groups, one of the learnings that we've had is that rather than having to wait for these large organized cleanups, this actually empowers people to go out and start doing things on their own. And of course, like we hope everyone will always still come to our cleanups, because it's great to get together and do that in like such a large group and make such an impact. But people don't need to wait for that. They can go out and do these cleanups on their own. And we're thinking about how we can potentially get supplies out into the community so that people can feel like they have, the right gloves and bags and things to help support that. We have a database that's set up. So when people go out in their small groups, you can actually go onto the Surfrider database and log what they found, so that it goes back to the Surfrider headquarters, and we use that to speak to the media, our elected official responses, things like that. So it's a great way to just activate each and every day.
That's awesome. That's great. That's really nice. I'm curious, actually, there's a little bit of a sway here, but how much of technology that you've been able to use to gather more data and more information? I imagine like being able to get photos from social media with geo-targeting must be really helpful in making a case or collecting that information. That must be wild to have watched that change over the last few years and see the activism become more effortless in that sense.
Definitely. I mean, we definitely encourage people to take pictures of these solo cleanups, use the hashtag solo beach cleanup, so that we can capture these moments. Like you said, like being able to target and have that proof point, and being able to kind of capture all that data has been super helpful. And, our database is actually relatively new as well. And with that, it's really helped streamline. And, Surfrider, I actually might have not mentioned this at the beginning, it's super important, but Surfrider is all volunteers. Like our chapter in the New York City chapter is all volunteers. So it's also about how we can leverage technology to create a more efficient team and use the hours that we have together to be the most optimal for our mission. So that has been something that's been super helpful. And we're continuing to look into ways that we can, better support. And even your point about the actual receptacles at the beach that you mentioned, that is something that we are desperate to find a solution to, because the way that they function right now is it really, I don't feel is the most efficient way to be able to deal with the trash problem. And I know the Parks Department, we've had some meetings with them this year, and they're really giving some thought into different ways that they can approach the collection and the kind of accumulation of the trash in a way that will help prevent it falling out, like always and every way. It has been something as well that we've been looking into, like whether we can get proper lids for the garbage cans.
Yeah. Or I got an idea. Like the ones you have in the UK, those big ones that you see that people put them in, there's no way to lift them up or dig into them. Have those on the boardwalk. And then on the side, you have written on there the rules of etiquette for surfing. Yeah. And have them use it as like a way to use for advertising or promoting Surfrider.
Yeah, no, very, very cool. I love that. I've seen those actually in the UK. That's a great idea. And we do have a campaign called Respect Rockaway and Respect Jamaica Bay that has some messaging around, not quite surf etiquette, but we have been thinking about if there's a way to integrate that. But around just like how to respect the community and make sure that people are taking the best care possible when they visit. One thing that's kind of interesting about New York is that typically one of the approaches that people use is pack in, pack out. So ideally, people wouldn't even be leaving their trash at the beach, right? Yeah. They'd be taking it right off and like putting it in their car, taking it home and dealing with it at home in their like bigger receptacle, hopefully. But the reality of the situation is that many New Yorkers are taking the train or they're taking the ferry, and realistically carrying their trash like and packing it off the beach might not be happening. And that's where it really comes into this like brainstorming with the Parks Department around how do you manage such large scale, city beaches that naturally these types of solutions just aren't a fit.
It's complicated, I imagine. And there's a lot of logistics that have to go into it. I mean, we're having trouble just getting our street sweep during COVID. So it's definitely a challenge. Let's shift here and let's talk a little bit about the what you have going on in terms of water safety for all ages and expanding access. What is this initiative? This seems really interesting.
Sure. So this actually also was something that has sort of come through with different community work that we've been doing. And something that we really try and do at Surfrider is to like listen and learn, like what are the needs of the community? And like interestingly with this one, this is a little bit like outside the typical scope of what Surfrider does. Because, we're more an environmental organization, and thinking about water safety was something that wasn't like as obviously fitting within those bounds. But saying that, it was something that we identified was like a huge need for the community, that water safety had to be part of the narrative and had to be a focus. And over the last few years, it's been really tragic. There have been many incidences in the Rockaways from swimmers, sometimes surfers and other recreational users, where there could have been avoidances and people losing their life if there had been water safety education or sort of resources in place to support people when they were using the ocean. So in our kind of, exploration of this issue, we had integrated some water safety advertisements and messages in our public service campaign, the Respect Rockaway and Respect Jamaica Bay campaign. So that's one way that we started to explore it. But in doing so, we also connected with other organizations in the community that happen to also be focusing on this issue. And we all have come together to create a coalition in the community. So some of the other organizations are the Swim Strong Foundation, the Jamaica Bay Rockaway Parks Conservancy, Larrabea.
Yeah.
And all these incredible organizations out there doing an abundance of different programs and campaigns in the same vein of thought. And the idea being that, we're stronger together. So let's come together, let's unite and start to focus on what some of these water-related issues are. And hopefully in doing so, we're also able to create a more inclusive water recreation community. Yes. Because, unfortunately, many of the issues that come down to access to water safety disproportionately impact Black and brown children and young people. So they have less access to swimming